Welcome back, everyone, to AuthorStory. I am your host, Alexander Lim, and our featured book for this episode is Hands Up, Don't Shoot, Why the Protests in Ferguson and Baltimore Matter, and How They Changed America, which you can check out by clicking on the Amazon link in the video description below. The author, Dr. Jennifer Cobbina, is an associate professor in the School of Criminal Justice at the Michigan State University. So, Dr. Cobbina, welcome to AuthorStory. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Great. So first off, a little bit about yourself.
I've not had any personal incidences that happened to me that made me want to study criminal justice. When I was an undergraduate student, I found myself taking several criminal justice courses because it piqued my interest.
Okay.
And as a result, I double majored in criminal justice and sociology. But as I pursued my doctorate degree, I became aware of how race is a central component in the criminal justice system. I read study after study showing racial disparities occurring throughout the criminal justice system, from arrests to convictions and sentencing. So it's through that lens, not my personal experiences, but it was through that lens that I view law and order and the criminal justice system.
So, all right, cool. So you got into it. So you got into it later in life, then, rather than from some incident in your childhood. Okay,
Correct.
So you did speak on racism. So this is one of the basics I'd like to speak of. So racism, because our audience comes from all over the world. I'd like to get clear in everyone's mind what exactly it is that we are talking about. In this particular issue. So racism. What is the definition of racism?
So racism includes prejudice, discrimination, or hatred that's directed at someone because of their color, ethnicity, or national origin. So in terms of prejudice, it has to do with people's thoughts and feelings towards certain groups because of their race, because of their color, because of their ethnicity.
Okay. And what sort of acts, for example, would constitute racism? Like, this happens and you just know it's, this is something that's racist.
Sure. So in terms of what acts constitute racism, I would say that people often associate racism with acts of abuse or harassment,
Right.
But it doesn't need to involve violent or intimidating behavior. It can include racial name calling and jokes. It can be a situation in which people are excluded from groups or activities because of where they came from or where they come from. So racism can be revealed through people's actions, but it can also be revealed through their attitudes. It can be reflected in systems and institutions. This is what we call institutional racism. But sometimes it may not be revealed at all. So, because not all racism is obvious or overt. It can be covert, it can be subtle. For example, someone may look through a list of job applicants and decide not to interview people with certain surnames.
Okay, so, and racism, I'd like to bring out this point because it's not always conscious. The person who's committing the act may or may not be aware that he or she is committing that kind of act.
That is true. So, and I want to say too, so we all have bias. As human beings, we're breathing. We all have bias, and so I think it's important not to because we all have bias, but that's not used interchangeably with racism, because sometimes we use these terms interchangeably, and it can be a loaded word which sets people off. But we all have biases, which can include racial bias. And so in terms of racism, I will say that people, however, they're not born with racist ideas or attitudes. Racism is learned. For instance, there are some people who believe that some races are superior to others. And so this belief in racial superiority can lead to racial hatred.
So belief in superiority, is this sort of the mindset that's behind racism?
Yeah, so that can play a role. The belief that one racial or group or ethnicity is more superior than that of another. However, not all racism stems from hatred. Some of it can stem from fear or anxiety. Some are concerned that certain demographic groups pose a threat either to themselves or to the safety of the community, or even to the national identity. And so ignorance can also play a role in feeding people's racial attitudes.
Okay. So I'd like to go on a bit of a sidebar here. Do you think education, like a better educated person, has a lesser chance of being racist, or are the odds just about equal?
Yeah, I don't think so. In terms of formal, if are you talking about formal
Formal
education?
education, formal education, yes.
So I'm not quite sure about that. I think I wouldn't say that. I do think that the willingness to come into contact and talk and connect and have relationships with people who are of different racial groups, different ethnicities, ethnic groups than our own, I think that's important, because in doing that, we're able to make connections and see commonalities between two people, even though they may be of two different racial or ethnic groups. And so I think that's important, because you can be formally educated and
Right,
still have these views, particularly if one is not exposed to individuals of a different racial or ethnic group.
right, right.
Because what's driving some of these perceptions are really, again, prejudicial thoughts and beliefs of a certain group.
Okay, okay. So we've spoken then from the point of view of the persons committing the act. Now, what about those who to whom the act has been committed? What is the impact on racism on those who are its, for lack of a better word, its targets?
So racism certainly causes harm to those who are on the receiving end of it. It can harm, but I want to say it can harm individuals, it can harm communities and society at large. But in terms of harming individuals who are at the receiving end of it, studies have shown that profound effects on people's health. People who are who are treated in a racist manner often suffer from anxiety and depression, from sadness and anger. And experiencing racism on a consistent basis can really cause people to withdraw, to withdraw from work or to withdraw from their studies, and ultimately it can diminish their quality of life.
Right. So this not just a case then of sticks and stones and words won't hurt me. I mean, this has a real psychological impact. I mean, this just like,
Absolutely.
me throwing a stone and hitting someone, it's that
Absolutely.
impactful.
Yeah, and people who experience racism can be made to feel like second class citizens, and so therefore it's affecting their freedom and their dignity.
Mm, okay, okay, all right, okay. So the next issue I'd like to cover is the criminal justice system. I mean, again, to define a few terms, what is the criminal justice system? What is it supposed to do, and what are the components?
So the criminal justice system, it's a series of government agencies and institutions to control crime and impose penalties on those who violate the law. So the three main components of the criminal justice system include police, courts, and corrections. And
Okay.
so they are primarily responsible for investigating criminal conduct and gathering evidence. They're responsible for identifying people who are suspects and for making arrests. They're responsible for bringing charges and conducting trials, and then determining, sentencing, and treating people who commit crimes.
Okay. All right. Okay. So given all this, now, I mean, I'm sure you know what's going on right now in the criminal justice system. Can we see that in broad terms, the criminal justice system functions the way it's supposed to?
So I will say many people realize that the criminal justice system is broken, and
Okay.
it really focuses far too much on criminalization and incarceration, and far too little on rehabilitation. So the growth in criminalization has really led to mass incarceration. So the United States incarcerates more people than any other nation. Currently, 2.2 million people. Are incarcerated in prisons and jails in the United States. And so this is a 500% increase over the last 40 years.
Wow.
And what several studies have shown is that it's changes in laws and changes in policies, not changes in crime rates, that explain most of this increase. And so the result has been mass incarceration. It's resulted in overcrowded prisons and also fiscal burdens on states, despite increasing evidence that shows that large-scale incarceration is ineffective. It's not an effective means of achieving public safety.
Okay, and of course, the bottom line is public safety after all.
Yes,
Right, right.
yes,
Okay.
that's true.
All right. So again, with the criminal justice system, where racism is concerned, what is so with what is going on with the criminal justice system?
So I will say that there are racial disparities that exist throughout the criminal justice system.
Okay,
So,
okay,
for instance, racially biased use of discretion is one cause of racial disparities in police contacts that are not explained by differences in crime rates. Again, so there are numerous studies that have shown that police are more likely to stop Blacks and Hispanics for discretionary reasons. And I will say that there's a distinction between traffic-related stops, which is, when police officers are stopping people based upon how they're driving, and they're trying to enforce traffic laws or vehicle codes. But there's
right.
also a difference between that and another term that is called investigatory stops. So this is proactive stops that are used to investigate drivers who are deemed suspicious. And what studies have shown is that African Americans are more likely to experience investigatory stops than whites. And so traffic-related stops are based upon how people drive, but investigatory stops are based upon how people look. And so that's one example. The nature of police encounters also differs substantially for people of color compared to whites. Again, numerous studies have shown that Blacks are 3 times as likely as whites, for instance, to experience physical force or the threat of physical force during police stops. And they're more likely to be searched, even though there are studies that have shown that police officers have a lower contraband hit rates. That is, they're for Blacks. That is, they're less likely to find Black people in possession of something that they shouldn't be in possession of, for instance, drugs or an illegal gun, compared to that of white drivers. And so the hit rate is higher when they search for white drivers compared to Blacks, but yet African Americans are more likely to be stopped and more likely to be arrested. And in addition, people of color are therefore, I will say, once arrested, people of color are also likely to be charged more harshly than whites. Once charged, they're more likely to be convicted. And once convicted, they're more likely to face more severe sentences than whites. And this is after taking into account the type of crime that was committed and criminal history as well.
Okay. So there is that inherent institutional bias, then, as you would call it.
Yes.
All right.
Yes. Yeah.
All right. Okay. So let's get on a little bit with the incidents that form the base of your book. The deaths of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, August 2014, and of Freddie Gray in Baltimore, Maryland, in April 2015. Now, what are the salient facts behind the deaths of these 2 men?
So with regards to Michael Brown, so according to a report from the Department of Justice on August 9th, 2014, Darren Wilson saw Michael Brown and his friend walking in the roadway and told them to move to the sidewalk. Darren Wilson said he suspected that they were involved in a robbery of a convenience store since he received a dispatch call regarding the theft, and he was given a description of the suspects. Right. And again, based upon the report from the Department of Justice, Wilson testified that he parked his car at an angle to prevent Michael Brown and his friend from walking any further. And as he tried to open the door, Michael Brown reached into the vehicle and punched him and reached for his gun, and which resulted in Darren Wilson firing 2 shots, one of which hit Michael Brown in the hand. And the Department of Justice concluded that Michael Brown ran and Wilson chased him. And then Wilson shot him after he turned and charged at him. And so Darren Wilson ended up firing 12 shots, 6 of which hit Michael Brown, and including 2 in his head. I will say that several witnesses said that Michael Brown had his hands up in an act of surrender before Wilson shot him to death. However, the Department of Justice discredited the credibility of the witnesses who said that Michael Brown was shot despite having his hands up in the air. So that's the fact with Michael Brown. the facts of the case with regards to Freddie Gray is that on April 12th, 2015, Freddie Gray ran from a Baltimore police officer after making eye contact. He was caught and found in possession of an illegal switchblade, and he was arrested. There was a cell phone video of his arrest, which shows him being dragged into a police van where he's limping and screaming in pain. He requested an asthma inhaler, but this request was ignored, and ultimately he was thrown into a police van and he was unbuckled while riding in the police van. The van made multiple stops, and when they arrived at the police station, Freddie Gray was unconscious, and he had to ultimately undergo surgery because his spinal cord had been 80% severed and his voice box had crushed. And ultimately, he remained in a coma for 1 week, but died due to injuries to his spinal cord.
Okay. So I know this is probably a foregone conclusion, given that they were both African American, but did Ray Simpson, in your opinion, have anything to do with their deaths?
Well, I believe that, most people associate racial minorities with crime and crime with racial minorities. And it is that racial bias that typically results in police viewing African Americans as suspects, criminals, and dangerous. And so I think that that certainly plays a role in terms of the aggressive way in which both of these men were treated.
Okay, so in your opinion, and given what you know how things work, how would they likely have been treated had they been white suspects?
It's likely that they would still be here today if they were white.
Okay, all right, I got that. Okay, so let's get on to the protests. I mean, the deaths of these two men really riled up a lot of people, and there were a lot of protests took place. What is the background of the people behind the protests of Ferguson and Baltimore? Were these just ordinary folks, or were these something like, people who just want to stir up trouble?
No, these were certainly ordinary, everyday civilians who were protesting. They were protesting against police violence and lethal force towards Black civilians. So these are everyday civilians. Most of these individuals were young, first-time activists. This is not something that they had not engaged in protests. At least the people who I spoke to in my study, in my book, Hands Up, Don't Shoot. The vast majority had told me that this was the first time they had engaged in activism or protesting, and they did so because they were protesting the killings of Black individuals at the hands of the police.
Okay. And so what was it about their deaths, the deaths of Freddie Gray and Michael Brown, that caused all of these protests? What was there? Was this just like a sort of like the tipping point, or
Yeah.
what was the point?
So with Michael Brown, many believe that his death was unwarranted, even though it appeared to be lawful. Again, the belief that Michael Brown had his hands up in the air in an act of surrender and ultimately was shot dead by Darren Wilson certainly triggered the protests. But also, I will say that Michael Brown's dead body lay on the street for 4 hours in the hot sun. And so it is this image of his corpse that proved to be galvanizing. So while police reports claim that investigative procedures explain the delay in processing the crime scene, this really didn't make much sense to most people, most Black protesters. For many, they saw that this was indicative of the disrespect of Black bodies, and even analogous to a lynching, which was lynchings were a racialized state form of violence without due process, and that was used in the 19th and 20th century. And so Michael Brown's corpse was left on the street for hours in the same way that Black bodies were left hanging from trees. And I will say also, there's been several high-profile killings of police officers killing unarmed Black civilians. And so this really ended up serving as the tipping point, not to mention in Ferguson the strange relationships that the police have with the community of color.
Okay. So, with regard to protests, I just like to get a little bit into this. You did mention that they were ordinary civilians for the most part, because um, you know, there's conflicting information whenever there's a protest. You know that people riot and the protests were peaceful, depending who you hear from. So, what were the kind of people who joined in the protests? What were they? Were there different groups with different intentions?
Well, I do want to say that protesters are not rioters. Those terms are
Okay,
often used interchangeably, but they are very distinct. So
okay,
when we talk about a riot is a situation where people behave more violently against the authority, against people, against property, and so it involves destruction of property, looting, vandalism, and arson. But
okay.
a protest is a demonstration against a specific course of action or a demonstration against an official policy, and it is one's constitutional right to engage in protests. So, but second, I will say that most people who are protesting, at least the people who I spoke with, were against those who were engaging in rioting, and some had tried to stop it. Many had acknowledged, however, that even with that, it was actually the rioting that drew attention to the issue of racial injustice within the criminal justice system. Because had that not happened, it would have easily slipped forgotten into the news cycle, and it would not have received national attention. But again, so I will say, as I said before, that the people who protested were everyday civilians,
Right.
most of whom were, again, young. They protested for the first time, and they were protesting because they wanted to affect change. That is, they wanted to put an end to police violence and the criminalization of people of color.
Okay. All right, I got that. Okay. So I understand that you observed a protest, while you're interviewing people in Ferguson for the book. Given given that you are black, did you ever feel in danger from the police, even though you were just observing?
So I will say that it was incredibly intimidating. There was,
Okay.
a line of officers who were in riot gear with their shields, their batons and helmets. It was very clear that everyone else on the other side of the street was viewed as the enemy, and so it was incredibly intimidating.
Okay. So, and of course, among all the people that you interviewed, I mean, what's the general perception that you got that they had regarding the police?
So, although some people had positive encounters with the police, and they had told me that most had negative encounters, and these are experiences. These experiences actually affected their perceptions of the police. So, in my book, Hands Up, Don't Shoot, what I found in the study, there were racial distinctions. So, in general, the white individuals who I spoke to in the study were often afforded respect and given the benefit of the doubt by the police. On the
Okay.
other hand, blacks were more often likely to be the recipients of aggressive policing. They're more likely to be recipients of racial profiling and even disrespectful behavior.
Mm, okay. In other words, they weren't in short. Then they wouldn't be they a black suspect would not be treated with the same kind of respect accorded to a white suspect. I mean, this is general tendency then.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah,
all
and
right.
again, and this is even what several studies have found. Just again, the aggression that's used. That blacks are more likely to be stopped, targeted, arrested, aggressively policed, more than whites. And even I will say that even so the Department of Justice also did a federal investigation of the Ferguson Police Department and the Baltimore Police Department, and they found that both departments engaged in racially biased policing. And so, there was a pattern of unconstitutional stops,
Right.
unconstitutional arrests of
Right.
a disproportionate number of African Americans. And so, so this is just, it's not just a few people saying this. There was an investigation that found this pattern of unconstitutional, racially biased policing that takes place in both of these police departments.
Right. Okay. All right. So, I'm with among all the people you interviewed, was there any single story or person that gave a response that made you think, this ain't right?
Yeah, there were several. There were several
Okay.
stories, but I'll give you one. So, for instance, imagine that you're a teenager playing basketball with your friend in your neighborhood, and two police officers in a police car, they come down the street and they tell you to get off the street, and then your friend stares at them as they drive by. Now imagine that the police, they do a U-turn, they get out of the car, grab your friend, slam him on the hood of the car and say, "What are you looking at?" And then imagine that you find your voice in the midst of this aggressive encounter, and you ask the officer, what is he doing? That you tell him he's being too rough on your friend, and then the officer tells you to shut the F up. So this is what happened to Kevin, who was a Black resident in Ferguson, Missouri. And this happened to him when he was a teenager, when he was 16 years of age, playing basketball in his neighborhood with his friend. And so, and I remember just hearing this story and just thinking, and feeling Kevin's pain. And this had been in several years, but he still felt that pain and frustration and the indignity of how he and his friend were treated.
Okay. Okay. Well, that's a solid concrete example right there. So, thank you very much for sharing that story. So now, given that, I mean, there's a racial bias against African Americans, based on what you've discovered, based on with the people you've spoken with, and based on what you know, do you think that having more African American officers would change perceptions, the way African American community would regard the police?
So I think that's a great question because there are many commentators who state that if we simply diversify the police force, that it will change, it will make things better. And before I did my study, I also thought the answer was to hire more Black officers.
Mhm.
After all, the police department should reflect the community that it's supposed to protect and serve.
Right.
But what I found in my study is that while 25% of people in my study did believe that Black officers enforced the law more fairly than white officers, and that they were courteous and disrespectful and also respectful when they police. Another 25% of those I interviewed also argued that African American officers operate aggressively when they encounter Black civilians. And these sentiments were more common among Black Baltimoreans who actually had direct and indirect experiences with Black officers.
Okay, so it's not just diversification then. I mean, we're talking about a more fundamental shift in the way things operate.
Yeah, so and I think just saying diversify, if that's all we do, certainly it's not going to solve this problem. I will say that, as I mentioned before, that bias occurs everywhere, and the police are not exempt. Even Black officers are not exempt, and there is a tendency to associate, again, African Americans with dangerousness and violence. And and the reality is there are certain communities that are being policed much more aggressively than other communities, and you have residents who live in these communities engaging in lawful behavior and yet still being treated as if they're criminal, even though they're not doing anything wrong. And so and so I think even what we see is with some people having negative encounters with Black officers is that they too are being Black officers are also aggressively policing other Black individuals.
Hmm. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead. Sorry.
Nope, nope.
Okay. All right. Okay. So so let me just add a little bit of something here, because going to one part of your title, how these protests changed America. Have these protests actually changed America or changed the criminal justice system as it's presently working?
Well, it certainly brought a great deal of attention to the issue of race and policing and issues of racial injustice within the criminal justice system. Um, and we know that people are talking about it. We know that a number of people have joined, for instance, like the Black Lives Matters movement. That this is an issue that is not going away, and it's more than the Michael Brown incident. It's more than the Freddie Gray incident. It is about larger issues of racial injustice that exist throughout the criminal justice system, but also even that exists throughout this nation. And so people are having conversations and attempting to make change in the. And it's not going to go away anytime soon. That we're going to still continue to have these conversations and to push for racial equity and fairness within the system.
Right, and I mean the system itself. I mean the problem is really not just a simple problem. It's a complicated one. It involves personality, ego, as well as society and culture as well.
Yeah, and even and there's also a history. I think we also need to understand. Yes. Yeah, we also need to realize that America has a history of racism and violence that is really entwined in the very fabric of this country, and it really has yet to be systematically confronted.
Right. Okay. Okay. Got that. Okay. So. Dr. Mina, we can talk a lot about. There's a lot of issues, but in the closing minute or so of this interview, are there any last words of wisdom you'd like to share to inspire listeners, maybe?
Well, so along with what I was just saying, I do think it's important to address the history of racial injustice within the criminal justice system. There are some organizations that are beginning to do this. The National Initiative for Building Community Trust and Justice, they seek to improve relationships and also increase trust between communities and the criminal justice system. And so what they're doing is making effort to foster reconciliation, to build trust between police departments and minority communities. And so this reconciliation, it involves having frank conversations that address historical tensions and grievances and also misconceptions that can contribute to mutual mistrust and misunderstanding. And so I think a lot more conversation is needed where we're having important dialogue about these issues and confronting and understanding how the historical tensions that is playing, that's still affecting how certain individuals are viewed and policed. But then I also would say, based upon what I found in my research, I think it's important that we are investing more dollars not into the police and not into prisons, but really investing in marginalized individuals and communities. The reality is pervasive inequality and joblessness and poverty are all common characteristics of poor inner city communities. And so funds need to be invested in terms of trying to bring about prevention and intervention initiatives for at-risk youth and young adults. I think dollars need to be spent on addressing substance abuse and homelessness. Resources should be used to bring more jobs into poor communities and offer living wages and also provide quality education. And so I do make a point in my book, Hands Up, Don't Shoot, that ending the killing of Black people really requires doubling down on investments in communities and not the police or the criminal justice system.
Right, because I mean, you can invest all the money you want the police, but if the problems are still there, then nothing really is going to happen.
Right, but then there's also the issue of, again, like a culture of policing that also needs to change as well. Right. Which currently states that certain poor communities of color are to be aggressively policed, and all the entire neighborhood residents are to be treated as if they're suspects and criminals, and that's problematic and needs to change.
Right. Okay. Well, definitely words of things for our listeners to chew on, to think about that. Right.
Yes.
Okay then, in closing then, the book is Hands Up, Don't Shoot, Why the Protests in Ferguson and Baltimore Matter, and How They Changed America. The authors are guests, Dr. Jennifer Cobbina and you can find her book on Amazon. So, Dr. Cobbina, thank you very much for being an author story. This is a complex issue, it's a complex subject, and for our listeners who want to learn more, read her book. All right, so everyone, check out Hands Up, Don't Shoot. And while you're at it, go ahead and feel free to subscribe to our channel and check out not only all the great authors and books we've already covered, but also those whom we will cover in the future.